Welcome to our reading lesson for today. Let's get started by reading our learning target. I can describe the beginning, middle, and end of a story to understand the story. Now, we know that describe means to tell more about it, right? The way that we're practicing to describe beginning, middle, and end is by making those connections between each part. So the beginning is the start of something. It's the first part of the text that introduces the characters and the problem in the story. A problem is a challenge that the main character or characters face. Then we have the middle. The middle is the central part of something. It's the part of a text after the beginning, but before the end, in which the plot of a story happens. That's where our problem grows, okay? Then we have the end, which is the last or the final part when something is completed. It's where the problem is solved. When something is solved, that means that it's figured out. It's worked out to have a correct solution to an answer or to a problem. Now that we know what beginning, middle, and end are, and we focused in on the problem being found in the beginning, growing in the middle, and then being solved at the end, let's put that knowledge to practice with a story today. This story is titled The Shade Seller. Okay? Now, what is a seller? Seller is a word that is spelled different but sounds the same, and it has different meanings. So a cellar is a place underground that can keep things cool. But a seller can also be someone who sells something, sells a product or a good, okay? So here, the shade seller is someone who is selling a product or a good, okay? This is a folk tale. Folk tales are stories that are passed on verbally from generation to generation, okay? It's usually not things that could really happen, but people have, they tell it because it teaches a lesson in how to be better, okay? So we are going to read about the shade seller today, okay? Before we begin, there are a couple of words that we need to know. We need to know about this word. See if you can read this word based on the syllables in the word. Magnificent. Magnificent. Okay? Magnificent means to be impressively beautiful, elaborate, or extravagant. The new playground is magnificent. It is impressively beautiful and elaborate and extravagant. Okay? In our story, we're going to be reading about something that is magnificent. Now, in this story, we are going to read about someone who is greedy. Do you see that blend at the beginning? Grr, and then that adjacent vowel, E. Greedy. Greedy means having a selfish desire for something. So the dog was greedy with his bone. He had that selfish desire. He didn't want to share it, did he? He wanted to keep it to himself. In our story, we have someone who is greedy. They want to keep it for themselves. We also have the word tolerate. Tolerate. Tolerate means to accept, endure, or allow something to happen without stopping it. Okay? So I could not tolerate the dog's barking. So that's the opposite of tolerating. If I cannot tolerate, I can accept it or endure it or allow it to keep happening. I have to go and stop it. So if you can tolerate it, that means it can keep happening. If you could not tolerate it, that means you want it to stop, okay? In our story, we're going to read about someone who cannot tolerate something, okay? And them not being able to tolerate it, wanting to put a stop to it, leads them to feel some anger or frustration, okay? All right, let's go ahead now and let's begin reading. I want you to take your finger and put it on the first word. Remember, this first read through is just for us to understand what it is that our story is telling us about. You may be able to even start picking up on the problem, how the problem grows, and the ending or the solution to the problem, okay? All right, here we go. Go ahead and take your helper finger, put it on the first word. Ready? Read. A magnificent shade tree once grew near the house of a greedy merchant. Every day the merchant sat under the tree. One warm day a young man stopped to rest under the tree too. "Ho!" cried the merchant. "What do you think you're doing sitting in my shade?" "The tree belongs to everyone," he said. "It's mine. However, I am willing to sell you the shade," declared the merchant. "No one owns shade," said the young man. "I own the tree, therefore I own the shade," replied the merchant. The young man paid the greedy merchant. As the hours passed, the shade moved with the sun. When the shade moved into the merchant's yard, the young man did too. The merchant frowned. Then the shade moved onto the merchant's front porch. The young man followed. The merchant gritted his teeth. Finally, the shade moved right into the merchant's magnificent house. The young man moved right in with it. This was more than the merchant could tolerate. How do you think he was starting to feel? Yeah, he was starting to get kind of mad. He wanted it to stop, right? It was more than he could handle. All right, paragraph number 12. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "I'm simply following my shade," said the young man. The young man had indeed bought the shade. The next day, the young man returned and brought his relatives. His children laughed and played in the shade. His uncles and cousins sang and danced. The merchant could hardly hear himself think. Finally, he shouted, "I want to buy back my shade." "You sold it to me, and I intend to keep it," the young man shouted back. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. Soon after that, the merchant moved far away. The young man moved into the magnificent house, and to this day, travelers are welcome to share the shade. Got outsmarted, didn't he? The merchant was greedy. He was wanting it all to himself, the money he wanted all to himself. But was it the outcome that he thought was going to happen? It wasn't was it? What does the young man do that surprises the merchant? What does the young man do that surprises the merchant? Yeah, he keeps moving with the shade, right? He even moved into the merchant's house and brought his family with him. He said that he bought it, didn't he? All right, so I want you to think back to the beginning of this story. Who were our characters and what is the problem? Then I want you to think about the middle, how our problem grew. Then I want you to think at the end, how is our problem solved? Okay? All right, so now what you're going to do is you are going to answer questions 1 through 6. Questions 1 through 6 on page 266, 267, and 268, okay? These questions need to be answered so that tomorrow we can check and reflect on how well we did, being able to find the beginning, the middle, and the end, finding that problem, finding that solution, okay? All right, guys, great job.